I will speak about digital senses, analog landscapes, a De-Westernized approach of landscape epistemologies in Germany and China. So first of all, I will give you an introduction, basically stating my research question and the overarching research gap that underlies it. Then I will speak about landscape and mediatization, about landscape and sensory perception, and finally about the same topic and how it relates to aura and authenticity. And in the end, I will give some concluding remarks. So first of all, the introduction. Before I start off with my topic, I would also like to mention my use of the Cross Asia database, which I was cordially invited today to speak at. And for me, it provided a very helpful and neat tool with comprehensive sources, especially for Chinese articles on mediatization and media and landscape sources, and also English books on China that were not available in my home library. Generally, I worked with it using a keyword-based search in Chinese, and this produced a rich list of sources to evaluate. So what is my research about? Usually, when today we speak about landscapes, this discussion is often situated in the age of the Anthropocene. And only rarely aspects of, from digital detox or digitalization in general are covered. So this is quite a gap. On the one hand, we know landscape is important in the wider context of the age of human-made worlds and also of climate change. But on the other hand, there's a gap that there's no digital media involved. When it is investigated, landscape is still often approached from an aesthetic or philosophical perspective. And sometimes it has been discussed, for example, Olwig did so in 1996, that the melting of landscape into cybertextual space should be investigated. But of course, back then, which is now more than decades ago, there was no focus on ubiquitous digital media. Cosgrove noted in 2004, thus, any space is contingent upon the specific objects and processes through which it is constructed and observed. Questions of space become epistemological rather than ontological. So what is important? We are now trying to look at how space is constructed by humans and not what space as such is. So my research question is, what are the epistemologies of sensory perception of landscape under the conditions of mediatization, and how does it relate to aura and authenticity? And now it seems still quite an abstract question, but as we follow through the lecture, it will become more clear to you, hopefully. Generally, it's important to foster a more nuanced and up-to-date understanding of landscape in the 21st century. This research will also contribute to a scientific understanding of the rediscovery of natural belonging, as it plays a big role both in China and the West, and mediatization, which means that all parts of the world are entangled and informed by media. This process is global. And why did I specifically try to focus on China and Germany? Well, on the one hand, China is leading both in emissions but also in environmental protection nowadays. In Germany, as the counterpart, it's also quite an interesting case study because landscapes here are compact, culturally rich, and extremely diverse, with easy transportational access and considerably high protectional value. So I will first discuss landscape and mediatization. When we look at landscape, what does it mean? What are we actually speaking about? On the one hand, there's one origin that traces back to the German word of Landschaft, and it means the civic classification of a territory. Uh, so that implies a geographical part of an area defined by political boundaries. But there's also another definition coming more from the Anglo-Saxon tradition or the Dutch tradition, and it means we are dealing with a culturally shaped subjective perception of an area as an aesthetic whole. And this perspective also has roots, for example, in rich paintings or early works of artists. What is important in general? Well, first of all, it is very good to realize that landscape is only one aspect of nature that is particularly related to human existence. Nature, on the contrary, refers to the world that is independent of humans, plants, animal, rocks, water, climate, and ecosystems. So this also exists beyond any human perception or order. But this is not the case with landscape. Landscape is constructed through human perception of nature. It is something seen, evaluated, and often shaped by humans. Thus, it emerges from a cultural perspective. And if we go further into the discussion of what landscape actually is, it is not only important to acknowledge the perspectives from the West, but also to de-Westernize it. So it means how do people, for example, in China, relate to landscape? Geiling and Leibenhardt, two German scholars, write landscapes are socially constructed entities, drawing on Cosgrove, who states that landscape is not merely the world we see it is a construction, a composition of the world. Taylor and Qing, on the contrary, state that East Asian traditions emphasize that all landscape is cultural and that people are part of nature, also following a social constructivist approach. And this is something we need to bear in mind. Like if we look at the Western definitions, the ones that I mentioned earlier, we see that landscape is something far from people. But Chinese people see them as part of nature and therefore as part of landscapes. And this holistic view is also appropriated in documents which explicitly state the importance of nature as reflected in the Year Plan of China or in the concept of the ecological civilization. So what other concepts do we have from landscape? So on the one hand, we've seen it is quite valid to look at it from a social constructivist perspective, but there's also a rich tradition in phenomenology and also in critical studies. Ingold, for example, takes up a dwelling perspective who moves beyond the sterile opposition between the naturalistic view of the landscape as a neutral external backdrop to human activities and the culturalistic view that every landscape is a particular cognitive or symbolic ordering of space. And two other scholars who also researched East Asian landscapes, Djabarouti and Ren, highlight four integrative aspects blending Eastern and Western traditions central to landscape conservation. So we see here the focus is on conservation, but they say it is important to harmonize spirituality and aesthetics, that there is an equilibrium between people and nature, and it is important to balance continuity and evolution, and finally, stewardship between communities and practitioners. And what sticks out with what we've seen so far, that on the one side, for our landscape definition, we have the social constructivist perspective, meaning that landscape is perceived as an aesthetic whole with political boundaries, but also that humans are part of nature. And this is something we can take from the Chinese tradition. And so I will understand landscape in a threefold way: as an ever-changing territorial natural spatial formation that is defined by geographical boundaries, as an ever-changing formation which is culturally shaped through subjective perception, as an aesthetic whole, holding a sense of transcendence. And finally, and this is something I mentioned earlier, it is also a formation that is characterized by an equilibrium between people and nature, which is in constant flux. So basically, we've now covered what we deal with when we speak about landscape. But now the more important question is, what happens with landscape if we are in the age of mediatization? So if we look at concepts that are trying to explain how digital media changes the perception of landscape, it is first of all important that we have a concept that explains the change of space, in our case landscape, but that also addresses the change through digital media in everyday life of people and which follows a social constructivist approach. And of course, there's a variety of theories out there which explain some aspects, but there are very few theories out there which explains the exact change of perception of landscapes. In Europe, for example, there's been a rich body of literature on embodiment, but then also mediatization, as I previously mentioned, and I'll explain later why this is a valid concept for this approach. And of course, it's also important to look at what did Chinese scholars research. And of course, especially in the social sciences, there's a prevalence of Marxist approaches in the mainland. And of course, there's human geography, for example, Yifu Tian, who investigated the change of space. But especially the Chinese theories rarely covered the aspects of digital media. So this is why I picked the concept for mediatization, because it covers all three aspects: change of space, and it is essentially social constructivist. But we have a problem. This is a concept from especially the Scandinavian and German community. So how to de-Westernize it? And interestingly enough, and this is something where I found Cross Asia quite useful, because there's been a lot of research done in China on digital media, and I also found some research where Chinese people adopted the concept of mediatizations. There's an essential text about mediatization theory published in 2018, and as you can see here, the concept has been successfully translated to China. And there's also the concept of deep mediatization, which is also covered by Chinese scholar. And even more so, in 2024, there was a book by Peng Lan, who wrote about the mediatization of space in China. But I found an earlier paper, and I will go into this in the next step, by Jansson in 2013, a lot more useful. He says that this ubiquitous use of digital media in everyday life, it is basically, so the concept of mediatization basically refers to this long ongoing process of ever more and more media being integrated into the everyday life of people. And Jansson says this is not only relevant uh, on a timely aspect, that more media is being used every day, everywhere, but also on a spatial aspect. And he says there's three processes going on here. On the one hand, we see a normalization of social practice, the lived space, a premediation of experience, the conceived space, and the material indispensability and adaptation, the perceived space. And I will go into this in more detail. So the first one, the material indispensability and adaptation as perceived space, if we translate it to a more colloquial language, it means how we see the world through our senses. And this is something very important. If we speak about the perception of landscape, it is important how these modes of perception have changed through digital media. And he says that a key feature of the mediatized society is that certain types of tools and systems are constructed as necessary or indispensable for leading comfortably and socially integrated lifestyle. This indispensability of new media things thus refers to the general social acceptance of literally buying into a particular way of communicating and to the restructuring uh, through which the material presence of these things are naturalized in our day-to-day lives. So this seems quite theoretical at this point, but what does it mean for the perception of landscapes? It means that this ubiquitous digital media use as the new normal creates perceptual shifts. And I will speak about the six senses that people use in the next step of my lecture. And in our case, it is so that through digital media, we mainly use visual sense and auditory sense, and these senses dominate, and then they lead to other types of sensory processing. Remediation of experience as the conceived space means that we understand space through our knowledge. So the media not only shape our expectations and anticipations of future events and experiences, but they also generate particular forms of action and interaction that are performed or staged in order to become mediated within a certain representational register. And as I mentioned before, it still seems quite abstract to people. So what does it mean? It means that new forms of content emerge on the online platforms, for example, tourism content, or forest bathing websites, or conservation of cultural heritage in the web. And this, for example, means it can lead that these real life stays in nature uh, have a dominance, or people go more into nature because they see tourism content on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, or whatsoever. And by going into the landscape, especially this change in perception, which I will cover later, can be overridden. And the last aspect he covers is the normalization of social practices as lived space. And that means the meaning we ascribe to space. He says the appropriation of media changes social norms, conventions, and expectations at the level of everyday practice. These normalizations, which largely operate through common sense, pertain both to the timing and spacing of our life activities. And it also means the fact that something is so important that one cannot live without it. For example, specific rhythms and rituals within households and other communities, but also established informal agendas of media-related talk, modes of social monitoring and control, and stratified expectations of cultural media literacy. And this can, for example, mean that this ubiquitous use of digital media is so ritually integrated into our landscape visits. For example, and I will make it more plastic here. For example, if people go to nature, they won't go without their smartphone anymore. That's the way they experience and they discover nature, is by being online at the same time, and it's not the pre-digital area experience where people just went to nature, maybe, for example, just taking pictures or something, but now they go out there with their smartphones. And these changes in perception go hand in hand with new forms of routines in social media practices, for example, nature photography. And he highlights that all three practices are interwoven, and it is important to note that there is evidence that reality, and here landscape, has always been mediatized. So that means even in the pre-digital era, people went out there to landscape with media at their hands. And such time-space distanciation goes far beyond the invention of the printing press. For example, Borden and Balby bring examples from ancient traditions of using other types of media in everyday life. This shows the dynamic character of landscape described earlier, and that its perception has always been mediatized, and digital media just bring a new quality. And because all of this, what I now explained with the concept of mediatization, still seems quite abstract, I will now, in the next step, move on to how the perception of landscape actually changes when we use our senses. And this is something which in other theoretical realms relates very much to the body of literature on embodiment. We all know that every one of us has six senses: vision, audition, olfaction, equilibrium, gustation, and tactation. But how does the use of these senses now change when we look and perceive landscape? Vision. What is vision? Vision is the perception of visual stimuli such as brightness, color, contrast, lines, shapes and form, movement, and spatiality through the eye. But what does it have to do with the perception of landscape and digital media? First of all, there's been a huge body of literature that the attention span for physical environments has decreased. And the abundance of VR and AR and online simulations led to the prioritizing of visual cues and neglecting other forms of information processing. And I mentioned that earlier when I talked about the theory from Janssen, that when through digital media we have such a dominance of vision that other aspects, and I will go into more detail in that later, will gradually decrease. Streaming services now provide short, engaging, and colorful content, affecting other forms of media such as long-form content. And finally, we discover new aesthetic experiences. Online platforms, for example, often provide a filtered and aesthetically pleasing view of the world and lead to an appreciation of visual artistry. But on the contrary, being online all the time can also lead to screen dominance, which affects our eyes in terms of eye strain, fatigue, and sleep disorders. And finally, the emergence of deepfakes impacts our trust in media content, and it is difficult to differentiate between truth and fiction. And this shifts the perception of reality. And I think this example is also quite vivid when we look at landscapes. For example, somebody uses this stage aesthetic that I mentioned earlier on, or for example, uses AI to manipulate images. So when you actually go into the real world landscape, it might look completely off or completely different to what you perceived online. Audition is one of our other senses. It means that certain stimuli are informing us of the nature, direction, and distance of objects. The decline in face-to-face interactions led to a dominance of video calls and podcasts, for example. And finally, this immersive sound might stimulate a 360-degree audio environment, but still, the perception might be very different if we perceive it through digital media than if we go into the real world landscape where we are automatically exposed through a 360-degree audio environment. Of course, there are new forms of sound complexity and enhanced audio quality, but then again, if we compare that to the real life world experience, it's still a bit off. Nowadays, headphones offer the feature for personal soundscapes, intentional listening without distraction, and there are certain immersive audio experiences through AR and VR. And finally, there's a shift from linear to nonlinear listen experiences. But this is still just a certain degree of landscape and experience as compared to the real life world. So what happens with tactician in a world that is constantly surrounded by digital media? Usually touch would be referred to the process where we detect and process tactile information from inside and outside the body through neurons. These sensations come as pressure, temperature, vibration, and pain in the brain. And of course, VR and AR offer plentiful of technology, for example, gloves, full body suits, vibrating apparel, haptic technology, and users can feel the physical effects of touching, grabbing, pushing, and even vibrating while interacting with virtual environments. But, and this is my main argument that I keep developing forth and forth, it is still not the same as being physically in nature and being able to touch nature with the real haptic experience of our hands. The sense of olfaction is usually serving the function of detecting desirable foods, hazards, pheromones, and it is relevant for spatial orientation and nonverbal communication, and it is important to taste. But in the digital world, the use of olfaction is very limited. Of course, there's olfactory sensory marketing, and certain VR headsets might be able to emit particular aromas, and there's online platforms reviewing fragrances and perfumes. They stimulate curiosity and exposure, but it still doesn't compare to being out in the landscape and being able to smell nature in the real life world. Gustation is the subjective experience of taste sensations that are caused by stimulation of specific taste sensory organs, such as the taste buds. These five senses, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, allow us to differentiate wrong from right foods. But all digital media can offer to us is the exposure to new recipes, flavors, ingredients, and an increased awareness of global cuisine. It cannot mean that we can actually taste something from the real life world. Finally, the equilibrium, our last sense, is also called our sense of balance. It serves the perception of changes in position in relation to a gravity field to maintain balance and control movements together with eyes and muscle sense. The responsible sensory organ is the balance organ in the inner ear. And of course, here comes VR again and online gaming that may train the sense of balance in virtual and real life environments. But that still doesn't compare to being out in the countryside, looking at a landscape, climbing over a rock, for example. It is a very different perceptual experience. So we've seen so far on the one hand, the mediatization concept helped us to understand that there are certain shifts of how we perceive space, in our case, landscapes. By looking at these concepts, we could kind of understand it in a theoretical way. But by going through the actual senses, we now see that this shift is quite severe and quite broad in our everyday life. And now I will move on to aura and authenticity. And surprise, surprise, both of them change as well. So the status quo, we are now seeing mediatization without a hole. It is, and I've recently read a study online that the young generation are actually not spending as much time as online as they used to. And I think personally that's quite a useful trend because obviously they realize the huge impact of digital media on everyday life. But generally, um, these counter trends are still minor compared to what we do with media in our everyday life from day to day. And the road ahead is also a shift of aura and authenticity. Aura is usually described as the uniqueness of a place which can be impaired by media reproduction. And this definition by Benjamin, and I quoted him here from the 60s, but it actually goes back much further than this, because he described it about the issue of photography. And he actually refers to aura as a form of presence and absence, a sense of distance no matter how near. He writes in German, die einmalige Erscheinung einer Ferne so nahe sie sein mag. And about aura and landscape, he states, to rest on a summer afternoon and follow a mountain ridge on the horizon or a branch that casts a shadow on the resting person, that is to breathe the aura of these mountains, this branch. But now, he says, with photography, this shift of aura has already taken place because uh, what photography does, it basically reproduces images, and the aura of these reproduced images doesn't come close to the original. And here I argue something very similar because the virtual presence leads to a form of de-auratization. Because digital images, videos, and interactive maps make the landscape accessible anywhere, time and anywhere. And in this sense, they also lose uniqueness. And I think from a everyday life perspective, it seems quite clear that if we actually go out there to real landscape spot is very different to experiencing it online. Certain curated images and filters of landscapes also lead to a certain staged aesthetic. I spoke about deepfakes earlier. You might see something online, and when you actually go to that spot, it might look completely different. Digital media also lead to a globalization of the gaze. Local perspectives become displaced or standardized through imagery of Western media. So instead of having culturally unique features of landscape, uh, the imperfect Instagram spot looks very similar across the globe. Interactive and augmented perception also has an effect because GPS-based applications, AR or virtual tours change the experience of landscapes. And I mentioned that earlier, if you go out in nature and always carry your phone with you, it might be a completely different experience to what you basically saw and see without the media at hand. And finally, digital control and commercialization means that landscapes are becoming commercially viable through digital ratings, travel blogs, and algorithms. This also affects their value and worth. So what happens finally, and this is my last point I'm going to make today, what happens to authenticity? Usually we say what does it mean to be authentic, something as it is. And there's certain research on landscape authenticity, for example, from Nihus, and he says that it landscape is under flux even without human intervention. So he basically says even if people weren't there, landscape would naturally change. Landscape on authenticity, in his definition, can be understood by looking at the landscape as an integrated whole, as a living system, as history, and as spatial experiences. Here we focus on the changes initiated by digital media, keeping in mind, and this is important, the sensory shift that I mentioned earlier. I spoke about the staging aspect quite a bit. So landscape, it's no longer perceived in its natural authenticity. Uh, these look for certain iconic motifs or panorama pictures or the perfect Instagram spot. Of course, they don't offer an authentic landscape experience. On the contrary, we have very different trend as well. Anthropocene photography, for example, they display nature in crisis. And of course, if we go out to landscapes a lot and to nature a lot, we can also see the impacts of climate change. Digital maps, drone footage, and virtual tours allow landscapes to be viewed anywhere and anytime, and this also affects authenticity. And there's also algorithmic control and commercialization. Landscapes become consumable products whose value is determined by clicks and likes rather than by their cultural or ecological significance. In this way, we also can view landscape as a commodity here. It becomes something we can perceive with a product character. And finally, these new forms of augmented reality that emerge can overlay the natural atmosphere and affect authenticity as well. Same goes for tourism and environmental pollutions. That landscapes that were once isolated and untouched are artificially reshaped through an online hype. And I think I will close at this stage with some concluding remarks how all the theories I dug into are now being brought together. So where are we going? In a very hyper-digital world. And what does it do with the landscapes and our perception of it? In the first theory, we basically saw that there's a dominance of sight and sound in media, and this leads to a vanishing of other sensory input forms. And nowadays, landscape perception now becomes increasingly two-dimensional and not six-dimensional anymore. And I think this is very important to bear in mind because if certain senses are over dominant, in this case, vision and audition, and other senses are not being used anymore, I'm wondering what does it do to us as human beings? And of course, it is important to acknowledge this perceptual shift in order to regain it, because we are human beings. We need to use all of our senses. And through this staged media content and ritually visiting landscapes, it is so important that we actually go out there in nature, use our full sensory potential, and do, for example, nature bathing or go hiking, something very similar to this. And these processes with, on the one hand, the loss of sensory input forms and being in nature, they are intertwined with each other. So we can basically claim that there's a paradoxical relationship between landscape and digital media. Fostering landscape imagery can lead both to an increase and decrease of real landscape encounters. On the one hand, it can inspire us to go into landscapes and visit them. But on the other hand, we can also argue, okay, maybe we've seen the world through online media. Now we shouldn't be going out there anymore. We can just watch it at home and be focused on our screens, something very similar to this. And this paradox was especially visible during the pandemic. And so what's possible in the long run? of course, with every narrative or with every story you tell about digital media, you have both utopian and dystopian perspective, but it is important to create a balanced encounter where the sensory shift must be taken into consideration. And funny enough, I found something on the internet which is called the Internet of Senses, where people are hoping to create all senses on the internet in the long run. And I'm very curious where this is going to lead us in the long run.